Okay, so one last panel on AI, and we have saved the best for last because we have the most awesome panel to discuss how to make it human-centered and how to make sure it's a win-win. So virtually, I want to say hello to Eric Brynjolfsson from Stanford. It's so nice to see you again. I feel like we've been on a stage together at some point in the last few years. I can't remember what room, but nice to have you here. And here live. And here live in person is Darren Ajmoğlu from MIT, and delighted to see you again. Last time I saw you, we were having Chinese food in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is going to be a terrific panel, and I really want to spend most of the time just drawing out your incredible expertise and research, and the books that you all have both written, Darren most recently, really looking at technology broadly and how to make sure it's a win-win. I think maybe I'll start, Darren, with you, because Power and Progress, by the way, which is Darren's new book with Simon Johnson, also from MIT, is really one of those things that's a must-read. And it is it like 700 pages? How many pages?
Not quite.
Okay, but you know what I'm saying?
Short.
I'm saying that because it's a page turner. I mean, honestly, I sat, in my bed and read this, sped read this book, and did a review for the FT. It is fantastic. It looks at really about 1,000 years of technological progress and what it tells us about how you make sure it's a win-win. There's this sort of truism that we all know, particularly in economic circles, that technology is always a net job creator. It's just a question of how long. Well, Darren's research shows it's really only that if certain tweaks, certain actions, certain government policies are taken. So with that, let me just open it up, and you can kind of summarize the latest book and how you're thinking about AI in the context of that.
Well, first of all, Rana, thank you very much. Yes, this is working. It's great to be sharing the stage. It's not as good as our Chinese meal, but it's almost as good. And Eric and I have done these things before, but I think at this time I am now at a disadvantage because Eric, whose knowledge I have always greatly respected, now is sounding like the voice of God from above, so how can I compete against that?
You also have a really good TikTok, I shouldn't say this, but TikTok-worthy background. Your Room Raider is going to be on there soon, but okay, go ahead.
So let me actually say a few words to get this started, and I'll link it to the book. Thank you for that plug. That was fantastic. I need not say anything more. But I really like the theme of this conference, from price to power, because power is essential. But in fact, what type of power are we talking about, and for what? And for an antitrust competition crowd, of course, coming from price to power, we're thinking about market power or economic power. But that's just one facet of power. And Michael Mann, in his magisterial sources of power, distinguishes military power, economic power, political power, and ideological power, and thinking about orders and states. And in Simon and I talk of very related concept: coercive power, economic power, political power, and persuasion power. Economic power is very important, but I think today the most important power we have to come to grips with is persuasion power. And why? Because the most important problem in the digital age, and specifically now in the age of AI, is about the direction of innovation. And the direction of innovation is particularly important because it's going to determine whether we use this technology for good or evil. It's going to determine whether workers are going to benefit. It's going to determine whether democracy is going to survive. And what makes this so important is that technology is highly malleable. AI doesn't come with a user's manual that says, okay, it's going to be used this way in order for it to be good for society. It's a set of interlocking choices, and whoever has persuasion power is going to be in a position to set the agenda. And the direction of innovation is a very complex decision, and I think antitrust is one of the tools because it's going to regulate economic power, but it's not going to be enough. And let me give one historical example, which I think some of you may know about, but it's very telling, I think, completely different, but it's very telling. Today, we have 8 billion people in this world. we owe that to one very simple invention in the first decade of the 20th century, the Fritz Haber-Karl Bosch process, turning atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. Without that, we would not be able to support more than 1.5 billion or perhaps 2 billion people in this world. Amazing innovation, building on prior advances by German, Norwegian, British chemists, chemical engineers and chemical scientists. And immediately after this breakthrough, which was motivated very much by the hunger problem that was already endemic, Haber and Bosch and many other chemists jump on the bandwagon and start producing more potent explosives that have killed millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. So the same innovation, but which direction you push it is going to matter very much. Was that a market power issue? No. If it wasn't for Fritz Haber, the next chemist would have done that as well. It was partly because there were financial incentives. The German military machine wanted better explosives before First World War I. But it was also an ideological or persuasion problem. They completely believed that it was the just cause for the German military to be stronger. And so they were completely in line with that. So I think the question is, how can you have persuaded them not to do so? And I think it requires a completely different ecosystem. It requires a different economic structure, but it also requires different sets of values, different sets of priorities. And I think today, the key issue that we are facing is that we are at the cusp of potentially major changes in digital technologies and AI. I'm still not sure that it's going to be as much as some of its biggest proponents promise, but it's clear it's going to be transformative in many different directions. And I think there is the potential, and I think Eric and I here are in complete agreement, but Eric will be more eloquent in explaining it. There is a direction in which we can use these technologies in a pro-human way. Pro-worker, meaning increase worker capabilities, worker tasks, worker empowerment. Pro-democracy, help democratic institutions and citizens' participation in politics and better communication without manipulation. But right now, I think the problem is that we have created a tech ecosystem led by tech entrepreneurs, tech engineers, and tech financiers, which is pushing in a very different direction. That direction is a disempowering one. Human agency is reduced, tasks are automated at breakneck speed even when productivity does not warrant it, data is collected without any guardrails, and it's at the end of the day, machines over human. But that's actually not really true, because there's all this talk of machines and killer robots, etc. Actually, the problem is not machines over human. It's under the pretense of machines over human, a small group of people, small elite, using the machines, using algorithms over other humans. That's the problem. And I think that direction is extremely pernicious, and the question is how we can change it. And I think the way to change it is by really tackling economic power, market power, but also persuasion power, because the tech industry's dominance comes from the fact that they have a narrative that they have sold it about very creative tech entrepreneurs that are going to disrupt everything for the benefit of the good of the society. AI machines are going to be so much better than us, and then we're going to be just so much helped by AI. All of that comes together and creates this narrative, helped by the media sector in the US, by the way. Rana is not part of that. There are some amazing journalists in the UK who have
try to be contrarian.
Right, who are contrarian. I like that. But the whole media ecosystem supports this, and that persuasion power has become stifling. So we need something even much more radical than market power issues.
So let me amplify a couple things and then turn to Eric. First of all, cognitive capture, huge issue. When I wrote my first book about finance, I thought banks had cognitive capture. They don't have anything on platform tech. And I think complexity only adds to the ability to really get that cognitive capture, which is why simple prescriptions and conversations like this are so important. You talked about the tech v. the humans. You're already seeing actually some of the humans striking back. The Hollywood strikes, for example, are really about AI. They're about IP. Eric, I'm going to turn to you now. You did a really lovely piece in the FT recently, a conversation with my colleague Tej, which summarized a bunch of your views, and I encourage people to check that out if you want more. You also wrote, before that, Race Against the Machine. How do you see, give me just a beat or two on your own historical perspective, just to complement what Darren has said. And then I'd like you to talk a little bit about your idea that you think AI will be more about augmentation rather than replacement, because, right now I kind of feel like the jury's out, but give us that argument.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to talk to you again, Rana. And Daron, I love it out here in California, but my biggest regret is that we don't get to interact as much as we used to. But my views are very consistent with what you just heard from Daron on most things. We can touch on some of the places where we may differ as well. But I see us entering a time of radical uncertainty on many dimensions. I mean, some of them, there's some known unknowns that are already very radical in terms of what's going to happen with democracy, wars, climate. We know that there is another pandemic coming. We just don't know when. But the biggest uncertainty is around AI. I see it as the most powerful technology that we've ever had. And that means we have more agency in many ways because it's a very powerful tool to change the outcomes. Some of those uncertainties, well, let me characterize 3 places where there's some major uncertainties. First is around productivity. There's the potential for just enormous productivity gains. We're seeing it in some particular areas, but there's also a history of these productivity gains taking years, if not decades, to play out. A second area of uncertainty that this conference is very focused on is around industrial concentration. These bigger models are getting more and more powerful, so companies are pouring a lot more, very big companies are pouring a lot of compute and data and model size into trying to be at the frontier. But there's also a direction where local data and smaller models can be as powerful or almost as powerful and more economically valuable. And then the last one that you asked about, and that Daron also touched on, is this trade-off of how these models will be used to either automate and replace human workers or augment them and extend them. Both approaches can increase productivity, and there's, in many cases, it is a good idea to automate and eliminate tasks. But in my experience, there's far too much emphasis on that by technologists who often are inspired by the Turing test, which is the imitation game. Can we make machines that imitate humans as closely as possible? And that's one way to build technology, but it's far from the only way, and I don't think it's the best way. We also see managers and policymakers putting their thumb on the scale, tilting us towards automating, replacing, substituting humans rather than augmenting them. I think that in many cases, the better approach is to use the technology to augment humans. First off, that creates a much higher ceiling. We're not just trying to match what people do. We can create a lot more output, and through human history, the overwhelming majority of progress has come from augmenting and doing new things that we never did before, not simply doing the same things more cheaply or with less labor. But secondly, and perhaps more profoundly, by augmenting, you're more likely to get a widespread distribution of the benefits. Keeping humans in the loop means that they're likely to get a share of the gains, whereas if you take them out and have production done increasingly by capital and technology, then that's a path towards much more concentration of power, as Daron said, of both economic and political power. So there is a path towards using machines to augment it, and I've done some studies where we found that this has been very, very profitable for the companies and very beneficial for the workers. It's not a zero-sum game. It's something where all parties benefit. And one of my missions, going back to Race Against the Machine, but more recently with my paper, The Turing Trap, and a lot of writing in between, and I know Daron has been very eloquent on this as well, is for us to think more about how we can use these technologies to augment people. And that means changing tax policy, it means changing some of our management practices, and it means changing how we conceive of what the technology is supposed to do.
I'm very interested in a couple points you're making. I mean, one is, the profundity of what's going to be shifted and the policy levers that would need to be pushed, because you're saying yes, better to augment, better to help humans use this technology, be more productive. I can tell you, I was at a big healthcare conference recently, and as much as we can talk about, hey, if you gave nurses an AI tablet, they could do what doctors would do, and then they'd be making twice as much, and everyone, those guys, mostly guys, are looking to replace as much labor as quickly as possible, and that will only increase in the next economic downturn.
Well, let me give you an example there. So one of my other MIT colleagues had worked on an AI system for radiology, and she's a technologist. And when she first implemented, she said, "Well, this can replace a lot of what radiologists do." And then she found that it was not being adopted. Yeah. And one of the reasons was that radiologists were not dying to replace themselves, and there's a lot of politics involved as well as economics in adopting them. And so then she changed tack and had it focus much more on how can it make their jobs better, allow them to diagnose things they couldn't have done before, find new ways of benefiting the patients. And so I think even in that setting, people often, both technologists and some of the hospital administrators that I think you were referring to, are too quick to focus on the automation side. But I'll add a third thing. I talked about how that ceiling is higher and how it's more widespread benefits. It's also much more likely to be organizationally adopted if all the parties are benefiting from it than if it's taking from one group and benefiting a different group. So I agree that it's not the first thing that a lot of people think to do, but hopefully with this panel and others like it, we're going to get people to think more about how everyone benefits by having the pie widely shared.
Well, indeed, and I hope that message will come away, because we're talking about, if the populism that we have at the moment is at least in part due to 8% of the manufacturing workforce being disintermediated, we're about to see 40% of white-collar work disintermediated. So, note to politicians, you're not going to want to be walking in the streets after that one if we don't get the policy right. But let me focus on and really bring back in the last 3 minutes that we have the point about antitrust and competition. You landed on something very important, which I think I want to amplify, that nimbler, smaller when it comes to AI can work just as well, if not better. That belies the national champions argument that is really strong at the moment in Washington. The usual sort of lobby bodies are really pushing that out. And also this point about the need for education, the need for training. Maybe we can just have a final minute or two from each of you on where's the low-hanging fruit policy-wise, and how can competition policy play a role here? Darren.
I think there are so many issues we have to think about, but you're absolutely right, Rana. We have to think about policies, and I think simple policies are very important because A, they have a greater chance of being implemented, and B, if they are powerful, then they can start changing the way that people think about the system and what we want from technology and what technology can achieve. I think right now what I called the tech industry's hold on technology and the narrative is powered by a couple of economic processes. One is exactly like Eric emphasized, and the centerpiece of my work and the book that you so nicely cited, which is automation at the expense of creating new tasks. The second one is platforms monetizing data. And I think these two together create the bookmarks around which all digital technologies are being developed. And I think both of them are creating huge distortions. And in both cases, I think there are very simple tax policies we can consider that would create better incentives. In the case of automation, part of the reason, it's only part of the reason, by the way, that there is so much emphasis on automation is because all developed nations, but especially the United States, subsidizes capital and taxes labor. We give so many tax breaks and ways of writing off profits when you invest in a machinery to replace labor, but if you hire workers, you have to pay payroll taxes, you have to pay income taxes. If you train workers, you have to pay for that as well. So we can try to create a fairer tax system where at the margin, capital and labor are taxed more similarly. And Eric was mentioning that. But let me mention a second one because I think it's very simple and it's something that European Commission could play a leadership role, a digital ads tax. So digital ads are the lifeblood of the current digital technologies and AI systems, and they create a very pernicious dynamics about how data is expropriated and monetized. They kill other business models, and we've seen how they have backfired in the context of all of the democracy, citizenry issues. And I think this is the direction AI is going. A digital ad tax would create better incentives and would create room for alternative business models, which could be much better. And add to that, of course, the usual antitrust and the big size issues are always relevant. But I don't think they are as definitive as the incentives of all of the players in the market.
Okay, great point. Last 30 seconds or so to you, Eric.
Okay. Well, first off, +1 to what Daron said. Let me just say a bit about the technology. One of the reasons these models have become so powerful recently is because of what are called scaling laws, that if you double or 10x the compute power, the data, the number of parameters, you get a predictable improvement. And this is held true for 5 or 6 years now, about 8 or 9 orders of magnitude. You don't see many laws like that. And this is pushing towards much bigger models. But on the other side of it, having small, nimble models using local data, they may not be quite at the frontier, but they often have as much or more economic value because they have the relevant data. And one of the things that policy can do is try to encourage lots of competition and smaller models. In addition to what Daron said, I think an opportunity is there to enforce or encourage standards and interoperability. I'll give you the example of telephone number portability. A couple decades ago, mobile phone companies would not let you move your phone number from one company to another. They said, their servers would melt if they had to try to do that. But then the government in the United States said, well, you're going to have to do it. And, the next day they did it. I think that highlights that there's a gap between the private incentives to try to silo people and lock in users versus having them interoperable. We do have interoperable. We can call each other using different carriers. It's not so interoperable in social networks. Large language models often have proprietary data. The internet is interoperable. So there are many examples where we've made choices to either have things interoperable or not. The advantage of that is that then you can get the benefits of scale, you can get the benefits of networks, yet you also get the benefits of competition. But it's not something that happens organically. It's something that does require policy intervention. That's
such a great point, and it's something you're echoing. Both of you are actually echoing some of the things we've heard from others today. Heather Boucher from the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House also mentioned interoperability. Catherine Tai, USTR, talked about data, some of the data issues, Darren, that you mentioned.
Data portability, exactly.
Yeah, data portability. This is great stuff. We could go on and on with you all, but pick up both their books, read the FT piece, and welcome and thank you to both Darren and Eric.
My pleasure.